All right, looks like we can make a start. Welcome everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Meshed RTO Manager AVETMISS Crisis and VET webinar for 2026. My name is Shivangi Garg and I'm Compliance and Integration Consultant here at Mesh Group. With AVETMISS reporting deadline approaching soon, I hope today's session helps you in completing your AVETMISS reporting using the Meshed Crisis or the VET platform. Since we have a mixed audience today from the Mesh Cricos product as well as the Meshed Vet product, some terminologies and some screenshots in the presentation may look a bit different to you, but we've tried to keep the content as generic as possible. Before we proceed any further, if you do have any questions or any feedbacks throughout the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat box along with the college name and email address. We'll try to take some questions in the session based on the time that we have. If we do run out of the time, then we'll get back to you with your questions later on via Zendesk ticket. So feel free to use the chat box for any Q&As. So let's make a start. So in today's session, we'll be looking at how the AVETMISS reporting can be completed using the meshed platform. So this is the items or the list of agenda that we are looking to cover today. The session's going to look at the basics of AVETMISS reporting, where we'll first try and understand what AVETMISS actually is. I know that there are some users here who may be doing AVETMISS reporting for the first time, so this could be a good introduction. We will then look at the data collection processes and timeframes along with the AVETMISS data reporting process as a whole. So we'll understand what are the steps involved in the AVETMISS data reporting process. So then after this presentation, when you try and finish your AVETMISS reporting or try and start with the process, you do have a guideline to follow. We'll also look at the extraction process for the NAT files from the system itself, which is point number 3 here. This is where we'll tell you how you can export the NAT files from the meshed system. And what is the NAT files data mapping? So when you look at the NAT files, how do they align with the meshed system and where to find that particular data in the system itself? In number 5, we have the submission tools and login details. Once we have the NAT files in place, we'll try and look at how we can submit this data to NCVR. And finally, what is the process of data submission to AVS using the NCVR AVS portal? So we'll give you a brief guideline and process to follow. And finally, we'll also look at some common errors and warnings. These are some of the common errors that we see across different providers, across different years. So we will have a look onto those. It may be something worth noting. And finally, we'll see how Mesh team can help you during your AVETMISS submission. So making a start with the data collection processes and timeframes and to understand what AVETMISS actually is. So AVETMISS is a national framework for the consistent collection and dissemination of the vet information across Australia. If you are a registered training organization, or as we call an RTO under the Standards for Registered Training Organizations Act 2015, you are liable to produce the AVETMISS report at least once a year to NCVR for the accurate and complete data of the training activity that you've conducted during the collection period. As an RTO, you may already be aware that you do have an option to report this data quarterly. So you can keep submitting your data from January to March, April to June, and so on, so that your reporting is more timely and accurate. Based on the data that you report to NCVR, students' USI transcripts get updated. So it's very important to have your accurate and timely data submissions done so that students' USI transcripts can reflect the correct unit outcomes and unit training activity details. As you all know, or you must be aware already, that NCVR's data validation software will accept the 2025's data until 28th of February 2026, which is the current deadline or the due date as we call for the NAT files or the AVETMISS data submission. Each year, the AVETMISS data submission is usually due on the last day of February, which is again 28th of Feb this year. Again, as we should be aware that we need to submit the activity data for units between 1st of January 2025 till 31st of December 2025, which is the collection year data for 2025. If you need more information to understand how NCVR operates or what are some of the timelines and some of the fact sheets to consider, you can use this link and it will take you to the RTO hub where you can find some useful tools produced by NCVR to help you with your AVETMISS data submission. Now that we have understood the key concept of AVETMISS and what data collection processes and timeframes look like, let's move on to understand what is the AVETMISS data reporting process. So these are some of the very broad steps that you can follow as a first time or a recurring user to submit your NAT files. So the first step obviously is to extract the NAT files from RTO Manager, either your Cricus product or the VET platform, whichever you're using. But before that, the first step, which goes without saying, is to have the correct data entry in the system. So once that is there, you can export the data files from the system. And in step number 2, you can upload these files into NCVR. You can then check for any errors or warnings, which is usually the file status or the validation status. And if there are any errors or warnings, you need to fix that data in the meshed RTO manager system. Again, the process repeats where you have to re-extract the NAT files once the data has been fixed, and then you can proceed on to checking the file status again. And if all validated, you can simply submit your data to NCVR. So this is a high level information on what the process looks like for NCVR data submission, but we'll look at each of these steps in a bit more detail in the upcoming slides. So the first step, which is to export the data from the RTO manager system, starts with having the access to the system itself. If you are a user who has an administrative role, which is an S admin or an admin role to the system, you can log into the platform and you will be able to see this AVETMISS reporting tab on the feature and shortcuts page, which is under the home section itself. So as soon as you log in, this should be the landing page and you will be able to locate the AVETMISS data export function. Once you go inside this icon, you will see that it contains a range of filters and parameters for you to select and export the data. Now, this is where the most important part is. If the extraction of the data is not correct, then you can expect some additional errors in your report, which may look a bit unusual. So the first step here is to ensure that you're selecting the correct filters when you're exporting the data. AVETMISS type to export, which is the first filter as you can see on the screen here, should be AVETMISS for national because you're submitting your data to NCVR, which accepts the data in national format. So do not export the data in state format. It should be in the national format. The report type should be final report yearly since we are submitting the end of year data collection. And then collection year would be the collection year for which you're submitting the data, which in this case is 2025. You can keep all the states selected or checked by default, and then you can export the data for non-claim only. By non-claim, this terminology in the system means any student who is not a claim funding or a state-sponsored student. You can click on non-claim and then export the data into TXT NAT files or text file format. This is where the system will generate a zip folder that will contain the NAT files for your platform. Now, once you have the zip folder and once you open the zip folder, you will see that it contains 10 NAT files. So this is a check that you must do as an end user once you've exported the data from the system to check and ensure that your zip folder does contain 10 files. If one or the other file is missing, then it is always recommended to rerun the export so that you have all the 10 files in place. Let's look at each of these files very briefly to understand what each file means and where does this data sit in the mesh system. So in case if you have any errors in any of these files, you know where to go and fix that data. The first file in the set is the NAT10 file, which is the training organization or the RTO details file. As the name suggests, this file contains information on the training organization or the RTO itself. You have details such as the training organization identifier and the training organization name. Both these information come from the college information setup under the admin section that is done for the first time when setting up the platform itself. If you have any issues in NAT 10, then you have to go under admin college info setup and fix either the RTO code or the college name. These details must align with how they appear on training.gov.au. So usually if there is any error in NAT 10, it's advisable to compare the mesh data along with your TGA registration. The second file in the set is the NAT 20 file, which is the Training Organization Delivery Location file. As the name suggests, this file contains data on the training organization's delivery locations or the venues that you use to deliver training in 2025. This will contain all the details about the training location venues, including their address details as well as the RTO codes. For this, if you have any errors, the data sits under Manage Venues/Training Location page in the system. There you will be able to go and find all these details. So if you have an issue in the venue setup in the system, it's most likely causing an error in your NAT 20 file. NAT 30, which is the third file in the set, is about the course, program, or full qualifications. This file will bring any courses that were delivered as a part of your training in the collection period. So you may have multiple courses that your college offers, but if you only delivered certain courses during the collection period, those are the courses that will appear in your NAT 30 file. It contains details such as the program identifier, which is the course code or the national code in the system. Then you have the program name, which is the course name in the system. And finally, the nominal hours, which come from the total nominal hours as you set up under the course. Any errors in NAT 30 would lead you to the course manage page in the system where you can go and simply edit the course details to match as per TGA. Next file is the NAT 60 file, which we call as the module or unit of competency file. This file contains details on the units that were delivered in your collection year. Again, you may have number of units that your college offers, but only the units that were delivered during 2025 will appear in the NAT 60 file. Any issues or errors in the NAT 60 file should mean that you need to go under the course, subject, and unit page to fix up the unit details because that's what brings up the data in the NAT 60 file. It contains details such as the unit ID, unit name, field of education, red flag, and finally the unit nominal hours. Next file, which contains a lot of detail, is the NAT 80 or the student file, or as NCVR calls the client file. As you can see from the fields in the file, this file contains details about the student and the demographic information of the student. All this information sits under the student profile page in the system. As you can see, we have provided mapping on what each field means in the mesh system and what is the name of that field in the mesh system. So if you have any issues or errors or warnings in your NAT 80 file, then you must go under the student profile page and fix data regarding the student details or the address details as it appears. Next file, which is linked to the previous file, is NAT 85. As you can see, this is the client postal details file. So the first file we talked about was the student details file, and now we have the student postal details file where we talk about the postal address for the student. So again, as you can see, it contains the basic name details of the student and then contains the contact information plus the address details. All this information again comes from the student profile page. So any issues in NAT 80 and 85 are to be fixed under the student profile or home page in the system. Next two files in the set are the NAT 90 and NAT 100 files. Now, these are two files that may or may not have any data depending on how your organization records and collects data, and if you have any students with disability or prior educational achievements. So if you find that these files are empty, it's still all right because you may not have any student who has reported any disabilities or have any prior educational achievements. So NAT 90, the disability file contains disability information which comes from the student profile page, and NAT 100 contains any prior educational achievements which again comes from the student profile page. The last two files are one of the most critical files in the whole zip folder. The next file that we're looking at now is the NAT 120 or the training activity file. This file combines data from all the previous files that we have talked about and produces a result for unit enrollment activity for the student. As you can see, this file contains information about student unit enrollments, so the data comes from the student results page in the system. It contains information such as the activity start dates, end dates, the delivery modes for the unit enrollment, the funding sources, and the training contract identifier details if applicable. Any issues in the NAT 120 file may require you to fix data on the student results page, but as this file contains data from other sections as well, you may need to revisit some of the previous sections and fix up data accordingly. The last file in the set is the NAT 130 file, which is the qualification completed file. This file contains information on any course or full program completions that the students have undertaken during the collection period. If you only have student completions in standalone units or modules, those will not appear in NAT 130. So NAT 130 will only look at the full program or full qualification completions. This file brings data from the student course page. And one thing to understand here is that the student course status must be accurate for them to appear in NAT 130. Only graduated and completed students are eligible to appear in NAT 130. If you are recording any other status for a student's course completion, those students may not appear in your 130 file, so you can always cross-check and change the statuses accordingly. This file also contains information on the parchment or the certificate details, which includes the parchment issue date as well as the parchment number, which is the document number and the date generated in the system. Now that we know all the 10 files and we've understood briefly what each file means and where does this data sit in the system, we can start talking about the submission process. The submission process requires you to go to the AVS portal, which is step number 1. If you are a training organization that has reported data previously, you may already have an access to the AVS portal. But if you are a first-time RTO producing the AVETMISS report, then you may have to register to go to the AVS portal. So you go follow this link and go on to the AVS portal where you will be prompted either to register or log in, and where you can finally upload and submit the data for your RTO. In the next slide here, we do have a screenshot explaining how the screen and the process for submitting the data or uploading the data looks. So once you are in, you can see that there is an option for you to select collections and then go under new collection. Once you go under new collection, you will be able to see the collection details drop downs, which will ask you to confirm the organization as well as the type. Ensure that you've selected the correct organization, and then the type should be VET provider collection. The year for selection here should be 2025 since you're submitting your 2025 data. And the period should be January to December, which is for the whole year of 2025. You can also check the collection period dates here to ensure that the period you are selecting is correct. Once you have done so, please ensure not to click any preliminary checks, because if you click any preliminary checks, it will give you part validated status in your NAT files and will cause further errors and warnings. So for final data collection, you don't need to click on preliminary checks. Once you've selected the correct filters, click on Add Files. Once you click on Add Files, you can upload the zip folder which has the 10 NAT files as we talked about, and click on Upload. Once the files are uploaded, you will see them in the bottom grid and you can click on Validate. Once you press Validate, NCVR starts to run the validation on each of your files to see if there are any errors or warnings. And if all your files are validated, you can finally proceed to finalize submission, where you can sign the declaration and finish off the data submission process. Let's look at what the file status looks like as we were talking before. So once you upload your files into NCVR, you may receive these 3 statuses in your file. First status is validated, which means all your files are validated successfully and do not have any errors or warnings. This means that you can successfully proceed to finalize submission and there is no need for you to fix any sort of data. If you see validated with a blue underline and bold highlight, that means the files are validated, but they do contain some warnings, which may or may not be fixed. But if you see anything in red error, that means the files have errors in them, and those records must be fixed before you can proceed to submission. To get the details of what errors and warnings your file contain, you can click on export details as you can see in the screenshot here, and that will give you a summary report of which record in which file contains the errors. Now let's look at some of the most common errors and warnings. Because once you export the details, you may see one or more of these warnings or errors in your NAT files. The very first error that you can see here is the incorrect or wrong data format. This is the preliminary error or validation that NCVR runs. After this error is cleared, you will start to see other errors in your file. So this is just a data formatting error or the file format error. For this data, this wrong data format actually talks about the data format which we looked at the data extraction. So state data must be submitted via STA and extract data in national format using the correct parameter. So if your extraction process was incorrect and you have extracted the data in state format instead of national format, then most of your files will end up in error. For this, you just have to follow back to the previous slides and export in national reporting format only. The second error is what I was talking about before, which is about records containing illegal characters or your file having an invalid format. This is a preliminary check or a pre-validation failure. This means that some or the other records in your NAT files, which we have mostly seen in the case of NAT 80 and 85, containing any illegal or special characters, symbols, any hidden characters. And for this, what you have to do is open the file in Notepad or Notepad++, and then locate the record by placing your cursor at the beginning of each line. NCVR's error report will tell you which record has error, the record number. So you will have to locate that record number manually in the text file and then fix that data in the mesh system. The third most common error is the cross-year units reported with a valid final outcome. A cross-year unit is a unit where the activity start date and finish date is not in the same year. So your units may have started in 2025, but they are rolling over to 2026. In that case, you should report the data with outcome code 70 or CE, which means continuing enrollment. Because the data reported is only up till 31st of December 2025, final outcomes such as C or NYC cannot be used. Next most common error is about incorrect combination of INTOF and funding source national. INTOF stands for International Offshore. This USI exemption code is only used when the client or the student is an offshore student and their funding source national is 32 for the unit enrollments. If the combination of the student origin and funding source does not match, for example, you have recorded the student's funding source as 31, then the NCVR system will expect you to report a valid USI for the student. So if the student is an offshore student, please ensure that you have updated the funding source national to 32 under the unit enrollments and change the origin to overseas offshore. This way, the mesh system will automatically generate INTOF in your NAT files. Next up, we have the wrong funding source or the incorrect funding source data. As NCVR only accepts fee-for-service or non-claim data, you are not allowed to submit any claim-funded or state-sponsored training activities to NCVR. You may find that your files are validated, but you do have a warning when you try to finalize submission, which tells you that your data contains publicly funded data. This means that your NAT 120 contains funding sources that are other than 31, 32, and 20. So when you're submitting your NCVR data collection, make sure you only have the fee for service data in your files. To check this, you can open your NAT 120 file and cross-check the funding source national, which should be 31, 32, and 20 only. To fix this data, you can go to student results page and update the funding source for the unit. Next, we have the course finish date issue. Most of you may have seen this error in your NAT 120 and 130 files if you have done the reporting previously, where the course finish date is not in the same year as the unit activity finish date. If the student is finishing the course in 2025, there must be at least one unit where the training activity dates, either the start date or the finish date, is in 2025. To fix this issue, you have to update the unit competency date for at least one of students' unit enrollments to fall in 2025. Next up, we have a warning, which is the overseas postcode or the OSPC warning. This is one of the most common warnings across all providers that we have seen. Now, as I say, this is a warning, which means this does not prevent you from submitting your data because this is not an error to fix. This warning appears when the student is an overseas student, whether international onshore or offshore, but then you do not have the permanent address for that student. For overseas students, it is important to have their permanent addresses because if you do not, then the Australian suburb gets reported along with their origin, which does not match. So based on students' funding source, which is 3132, and based on student origin, NCVR automatically assumes that the student is an overseas student with the postcode OSPC. So the country code and the suburb should be an overseas suburb and not an Australian suburb. So if you see these warnings in your NAT files, you have to go to student profile page and record student's overseas permanent address. Next, we have the incorrect unit code, program ID, or incorrect unit names or program names, which do not match with TGA. So if you see any sort of these errors in your subject or program, then you know that the data in RTO Manager is not matching what TGA contains. Then you have to go to the course manage page or the manage unit page in the system and update the IDs and the names respectively. Finally, we have the student address or training location address issue. You may further see some errors where the suburb and the postcode combinations are not matching, whether for the student address or for the RTO's address. The solution for this error is to check the Australia Post listing for suburb and postcode because that's the combination that NCVR follows. So you can simply go to student profile and check what suburb and postcode combination is recorded under the student and verify it along with the Australia Post listing. Another one of the most common warnings, which is not mentioned here, but I would like to bring up, is missing USIs. You may see it as a warning or an error in your NAT files data, depending on how many students are there without a USI. So make sure you have the USI integration up and running so that your USIs are recorded and they appear in your NAT files for data submission. This brings us to the end. So now that we've talked about the whole NAT files, the structure, how we can upload the data, how we can submit the data, some of the most common errors. Now that leaves us with the question, how can the mesh support team help? So you may be struggling to submit your data where you may have some errors and warnings and you're not sure how to fix them. So what you can do is you can send an email to us at support@meshgroup.com.au. Now, when you're sending the email, please make sure you're also providing us with the NAT files that you have used. We require the NAT files in the text format, not in the Excel format. And you also need to send us the error report, which is the NCVR error report. This helps us speed up the process. So give us all the data first, and then we can advise you on what data needs to be fixed and where to fix it in the mesh system. And once you do that, you will be able to re-extract the files and validate to complete your data submission. Since the due date is the end of this month, we recommend that you start early so that you have plenty time to fix any errors or warnings that your data may contain. I hope that this session was useful for people who are trying to complete their AVETMISS data submission. We thank you very much for your participation today. For any support, assistance, or any feedbacks or questions, please feel free to reach out at support@meshgroup.com.au. Thank you very much. And I can see that some people have posted some questions in the chat. I can see there are some questions in the chat or some messages. We may be able to take a couple before we close off for today. Let me just quickly have a read. If you have any questions, please also feel free to put your college name down and we can just get back to you. So Sam has asked a question, if the units enrolled, will it be reported as code 70 or CE by default? No, Sam. So if the unit status is enrolled or cancel, these are the two statuses that do not get reported in NCVR because they do not have a valid mapping. So you have to literally update the code to CE or 70. Cannot leave it as enrolled. Um, Next up, I think some of the questions are answered as well. Copy of webinars. Yes, Ryan, we will be making the presentation slides as well as the recording available. So that should be sent to all the registrants very soon. All right. I believe no more questions coming in. So we will end the session here now. But please feel free to reach out to us via email if you do have any questions after the session. Thank you.